In the quiet countryside of Oak Ridge County, a farmer named Hank Thornfield worked his 300-acre property that had been in his family for 5 generations. What happened when 7 bikers trespassed on his land would become legendary in 3 states. 27 men entered his property that summer. Only 12 left unharmed. The others never forgot the lesson they learned on Thornfield Farm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by random violence or spontaneous rage, but by something far more terrifying: the calculated determination of a man protecting what was his, hidden behind a facade of simple country living. In the summer of 2012, Oak Ridge County was experiencing the worst drought in 50 years. The once lush farmlands that stretched across the rolling hills had turned brittle and brown under the relentless sun. For farmers like Hank Thornfield, every day brought new challenges and mounting concerns about survival. Hank's property sat 15 miles outside of Mill Creek, population barely 2,000 souls, a rural community where most residents knew each other by name, and family histories stretched back generations. His farm stood apart from others, not just geographically with its remote location accessed by a single winding dirt road, but in reputation. The Thornfield land had always been different, producing crops when others failed and remaining strangely verdant even in the harshest conditions. Hank Thornfield stepped out of his farmhouse on that scorching July morning, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades under the open sky. At 63, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent his life working the land. His broad shoulders and powerful hands testified to years of physical labor, while his eyes, a startling shade of blue that seemed to reflect the sky itself, revealed an intelligence and watchfulness that visitors often found unsettling. Unlike most farmers in the region who dressed in practical work clothes from the local department store, Hank preferred hand-sewn garments made from materials he produced himself. His shirts were crafted from cotton grown on his own land, and his leather boots came from cattle he had raised and processed. Everything about him spoke of self-sufficiency and a connection to older ways that had largely disappeared from modern farming. Most striking was the quiet authority he commanded. When Hank Thornfield spoke, people listened. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, and there was something in his manner that discouraged argument or challenge. Even the most confrontational personalities in Mill Creek found themselves speaking more softly and choosing their words with care. In his presence, living alone since his wife Eleanor had passed 7 years earlier, Hank maintained minimal contact with the outside world. He appeared in town only when necessary for supplies or equipment parts that he couldn't fabricate himself. His rare visits were noted events, with townspeople observing his purposeful movements through the single main street with a mixture of respect and unease. The Thornfield Farm's isolation suited Hank perfectly. His nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and the dense forest that surrounded much of his property created a natural barrier that discouraged casual visitors. The single access road featured a heavy gate with nitrogen monoxide trespassing signs, so numerous and emphatic that locals joked about Hank having bought the county's entire supply. What most people in Mill Creek didn't know was that Hank Thornfield was far more than the simple farmer he appeared to be. Before returning to take over the family farm following his father's death, Hank had served for 22 years in military special operations, including multiple combat deployments to regions whose names were rarely mentioned in civilian conversation. His training had covered everything from advanced survival techniques to hand-to-hand combat systems developed specifically for operators working alone behind enemy lines. More importantly, it had instilled in him a strategic mindset that approached every situation with methodical precision and inexhaustible patience. The farming community knew nothing of this background. They saw only a quiet self-sufficient, Man who kept to himself and occasionally displayed unusual knowledge about subjects ranging from meteorology to metallurgy. His neighbors attributed these peculiarities to his voracious reading habits, evidenced by the weekly deliveries of books and scientific journals to his mailbox. Hank never corrected these assumptions, the skills and knowledge he had acquired during his military career remained his private resource, used primarily to make his farm more efficient and self-sustaining. He had no interest in reminiscing about his past or sharing war stories at the local diner. That chapter of his life was closed, or so he believed, until the day the Razorbacks Motorcycle Club discovered the shortcut through his property. The Razorbacks MC originated in eastern Pennsylvania as a small group of Vietnam veterans seeking camaraderie after returning from a war that had left them changed and unwelcome in their hometown communities. Over decades, the club had evolved from a support group into something altogether different. By 2012, they had chapters in 5 states and a reputation that made law enforcement officers check their weapon readiness whenever club members appeared in their jurisdiction. Victor Viper Kazarian led the Oak Ridge County chapter with absolute authority. At 45, he combined cunning intelligence with a capacity for violence that had been honed during a 10-year prison sentence for nearly beating a man to death in a bar fight. His dark eyes revealed nothing of his thoughts, and his face remained expressionless, even in situations that would provoke visible reaction in most people. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standing 6'3" with heavily tattooed arms and a black beard that reached the middle of his chest, Viper physically dominated most rooms he entered. His voice, surprisingly soft and articulate, contrasted sharply with his intimidating appearance. He spoke rarely, but when he did, every member of the Razorbacks listened with undivided attention. Beneath Viper in the club hierarchy stood Ray Demolition Walsh, a former demolitions expert who had been dishonorably discharged from the Army after an incident involving explosives and a superior officer's vehicle. At 38, Ray maintained the muscular build of someone who believed physical strength was currency in their world. His explosives knowledge had proven useful in the club's more lucrative enterprises, particularly those involving secured locations and safes. The club's enforcer, Dominic Butcher Reeves, had earned his nickname through methods that even other club members found disturbing. His specialty was ensuring debts were paid and lessons were learned, using techniques that left psychological scars far deeper than the physical ones. Dominic's hollow-cheeked face rarely displayed emotion, though a slight smile sometimes appeared when he was assigned particularly challenging enforcement tasks. The youngest full member, Travis Prospect Ellington, had completed his probationary period just 3 months before the Thornfield incident. At 26, he still carried the eager-to-prove-himself energy that older members had long ago replaced with cynical pragmatism. His technical skills with engines and electronic systems made him valuable to the club, while his relative youth made him expendable for riskier operations. Rounding out the core group were the twins, Lyle and Logan Terror Twins Donovan, whose synchronized movements and ability to communicate without speaking unnerved even their fellow club members. Both men stood exactly 5'10" with identical shaved heads and goatees. They had joined the club after returning from Iraq with matching dishonorable discharges for incidents their military records described only as conduct unbecoming. The final member present that day was Garrett "Ghost" Wilson, the club's scout and intelligence gatherer. His unremarkable appearance and chameleon-like ability to blend into any environment made him perfect for reconnaissance work. Garrett could move through hostile territory unnoticed, gathering information and identifying opportunities or threats before reporting back to Viper with detailed assessments. The 7 men had been returning from a regional meeting in Harrisburg. when their GPS directed them onto a logging road that promised to shave 30 minutes off their journey. The recent drought had left the normally muddy track easily passable for their motorcycles, and the prospect of reaching the cold beer sooner rather than later made the detour attractive. What the GPS didn't show is that the logging road crossed through the northwestern corner of Hank Thornfield's property, a section he rarely visited, but monitored constantly through a sophisticated system of motion-activated cameras that transmitted images directly to his cell phone and the computer. In his workshop, Hank was repairing a tractor hydraulic system when the first alert came through. He glanced at his phone screen to see 7 motorcycles passing the property marker that clearly displayed nitrogen monoxide trespassing warnings. His first response was measured. He would intercept them, explain they were on private property, and direct them back to the main road. Loading his grandfather's double-barreled shotgun with rock salt rounds, painful but non-lethal at a distance, Hank climbed into his mud-spattered pickup truck and drove toward the coordinates where the trespassers had been detected. He had dealt with occasional hunters and hikers before, and these encounters typically ended with apologies and hasty departures once the interlopers understood they were unwelcome. What Hank couldn't know as he navigated the rutted farm tracks was that this particular group of trespassers operated by different rules. The Razorbacks didn't apologize, they didn't retreat, and they certainly didn't allow themselves to be ordered around by solitary landowners regardless of whose property they might be crossing. The initial confrontation occurred near an old stone bridge that spanned a usually dry creek bed. The bikers had stopped to consult their GPS, trying to determine how much farther they needed to travel before reaching the main highway. Hank pulled his truck across the narrow track, effectively blocking their path forward, and stepped out with his shotgun held in a deliberately non-threatening position. "Gentlemen," he called out in the calm, authoritative voice that had once commanded special operations teams, "you're on private property. This road doesn't connect to any public thoroughfare. You'll need to turn around and head back the way you came." The 7 men looked at each other with expressions ranging from amusement to annoyance. Viper dismounted from his bike and approached Hank with the confident stride of someone accustomed to intimidating others into compliance. "We're just passing through, old man," he said, his voice carrying that unexpected softness that somehow made his words more threatening. "Our GPS shows this road connects to Highway 16 about 2 miles ahead. We'll be off your land in 15 minutes and everybody stays happy." Hank's expression remained unchanged as he gestured toward the private property nitrogen monoxide trespassing sign, clearly visible on a nearby tree. "That sign and 30 others like it around my property line aren't suggestions. This is private land. There's no access to Highway 16 from here unless you plan to cut through another 8 miles of my farm and break down my main gate." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly as Viper registered the lack of fear in Hank's eyes. Most people responded to his presence with immediate anxiety, a reaction he had cultivated and relied upon throughout his leadership. This weathered farmer with his calm blue eyes showed no such response, and that anomaly triggered a warning in Viper's mind that was quickly overwhelmed by pride and habit. "Listen carefully," Viper said, moving closer until he stood just beyond arm's reach of Hank. "We're going through. How that happens is up to you. The easy way is you move that truck and forget you ever saw us. The hard way." He let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication clear. Behind him, the other club members had dismounted and spread out in a practiced formation that maximized their threatening presence. Dominic Butcher Reeves made a show of pulling on, leather gloves studded with metal across the knuckles, while the Terror Twins moved to positions that would allow them to flank Hank if the confrontation escalated. What happened next would later be described differently depending on who was telling the story. The Razorbacks would claim that Hank raised his shotgun in a threatening manner. Hank would maintain that he merely adjusted his stance as Viper and Viper. The others continued to advance toward him. Whatever the exact sequence, the outcome was undisputed. When Butcher Reeves charged forward, Hank fired a rock salt round that caught the enforcer full in the chest. The non-lethal ammunition performed exactly as designed, delivering excruciating pain without life-threatening injury. Butcher dropped to his knees, his face contorted in shock and agony as hundreds of salt crystals embedded themselves in his skin and clothes. The unexpected resistance triggered an immediate response from the other bikers. Ray Demolition Walsh pulled a heavy chain from his saddlebag while the Terror twins produced knives from sheaths concealed in their boots. Viper reached toward the small of his back where he kept a 9mm pistol. Hank, however, had anticipated this escalation. Before any of the men could close the distance, he fired his second barrel toward the ground in front of them, the rock salt ricocheting up to pepper their legs with stinging projectiles. In the moment of confusion that followed, he retreated to his truck, calmly reloaded the shotgun, and used the vehicle's bullhorn system to deliver a message that would later be remembered word for word by survivors. "You are trespassing on Thornfield property," his amplified voice declared with unsettling composure. "You have exactly 3 minutes to collect your injured, return to your vehicles, and leave the way you came. After that, I will consider your presence a direct threat to my safety, and I will respond accordingly." The confident authority in his voice gave even Viper pause. There was something in the farmer's manner that suggested he was not making an empty threat. Moreover, he had already demonstrated a willingness to use his weapon, albeit in a non-lethal capacity. "This isn't over, old man," Viper called back, helping Butcher to his feet while signaling the others to return to their motorcycles. "Nobody makes the Razorbacks bleed without paying for it." Hank's expression remained impassive as he watched them retreat, Butcher cursing through gritted teeth as he struggled to mount his bike. Only when they had disappeared down the track did Hank allow himself a deep breath, knowing with absolute certainty that the confrontation had only been postponed, not avoided. Returning to his farmhouse, Hank moved with the focused efficiency of someone implementing a long-established contingency plan. From a hidden safe beneath the floorboards of his bedroom closet, he retrieved a satellite phone that couldn't be traced through conventional means. The number he dialed connected him to a man he hadn't spoken with in nearly a decade. "Colonel," he said when the call was answered, "it's Thornfield. I may have a situation developing at the farm." The conversation that followed was brief and to the point, consisting primarily of Hank providing specific details about the Razorbacks and receiving confirmation that certain resources would be available if needed. Next, Hank accessed a hidden room behind his workshop's tool wall. The space contained equipment and weapons that would have raised serious questions had any of his neighbors discovered them. These weren't the hunting rifles or shotguns common in rural homes, but specialized tactical gear that reflected his former occupation and the connections he had maintained. As he methodically checked and prepared each item, Hank's mind was already mapping out scenarios and response strategies. The farm's topography offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. The single access road could be easily monitored and controlled, but the extensive forest boundaries would be nearly impossible to secure completely against determined intruders. What Hank knew that the Razorbacks didn't was that the entire property had been subtly modified over the years to create what military strategists would recognize as a carefully designed defensive perimeter. Seemingly random features of the landscape, drainage ditches, rock formations, and even the placement of certain trees had been positioned to channel movement along predictable routes that could be monitored and controlled. By the time darkness fell, Hank had activated systems that transformed the peaceful farm into a sophisticated surveillance zone. Motion sensors monitored key approach routes, cameras covered blind spots, and passive infrared detectors would alert him to any body heat signature larger than a deer moving anywhere within a mile of the main buildings. In the farmhouse kitchen, He prepared a simple meal of venison stew and homemade bread, eating methodically while reviewing satellite images of the surrounding area on a ruggedized laptop. His movements betrayed no anxiety or urgency, just the measured actions of someone executing a well-considered plan. Miles away, the Razorbacks had regrouped at their chapter clubhouse on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. Butcher Reeves sat shirtless on a wooden chair, while Ghost Wilson used tweezers to extract rock salt crystals from his chest and arms. Each removal produced fresh cursing and threats directed at the farmer who had dared to challenge them. Viper. Kazarian watched this process with cold calculation, his mind already formulating a response that would serve multiple purposes. The confrontation with the farmer had become more than a simple matter of wounded pride. It now represented a test of the club's reputation. If word spread that a solitary landowner had successfully defied the Razorbacks, their carefully cultivated aura of intimidation would suffer. "We need to make an example," Viper announced to the assembled members. "Not just for him, but for anyone else who might get ideas about standing against us." The plan they developed over the next few hours was designed not merely to punish Hank Thornfield, but to completely destroy him. The Razorbacks would return in greater numbers, overwhelm any resistance, and then systematically dismantle everything the farmer valued. Buildings would burn, equipment would be destroyed, and the message would be unmistakable. Defiance carried consequences too severe to contemplate. What the Razorbacks couldn't know as they plotted their revenge was that they weren't dealing with an ordinary farmer protecting his property through desperate improvisation. They were unwittingly planning to assault a position prepared by someone with decades of experience in exactly the kind of asymmetric conflict they were about to initiate. As Thursday night gave way to Friday morning, neither Hank Thornfield nor the Razorbacks could have fully anticipated how the coming confrontation would reshape their lives and forever change the quiet community of Oak Ridge County. Just when you thought this confrontation couldn't get any more tense, the stakes are about to rise dramatically. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves tales of rural justice. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when the Razorbacks return to Thornfield Farm and discover exactly why Hank was the wrong farmer to threaten. The first indication that the Razorbacks were mobilizing came at 6:17 a.m. when one of Hank's perimeter sensors detected multiple vehicles approaching along the county road that passed near his property line. Moving to his monitoring station in the converted tool shed, he watched as a convoy consisting of 3 pickup trucks and 15 motorcycles turned onto the logging road that crossed his land. This was no small-scale intimidation attempt. Razorbacks had assembled a substantial force, likely drawing numbers from neighboring chapters to ensure overwhelming numerical superiority. Through high-powered optics, Hank could see that the trucks were loaded with equipment: gasoline cans, chains, what appeared to be acetylene torches, and various implements designed for destruction rather than construction. Their intent was clear. They hadn't come to talk or even to fight fairly. They had come to obliterate everything he had built. The rational response would have been to call the county sheriff, report the imminent threat, and request immediate assistance. But Hank knew the limitations of local law enforcement all too well. The nearest deputy was stationed 20 minutes away, and the department's total force consisted of 8 officers, responsible for covering over 900 square miles of territory. By the time the Razorbacks reached the stone bridge where the first confrontation had occurred, Hank Thornfield was nowhere to be seen. The convoy halted as Viper surveyed the seemingly peaceful landscape with growing suspicion. The farm appeared undefended, no blockades, no visible security measures, not even the farmer's mud-spattered pickup that had blocked their path previously. "Spread out," Viper ordered, gesturing for the Terror Twins to scout ahead. "He knows we're coming." "This is too easy." Lyle and Logan Donovan moved forward with the synchronized precision that had become their signature, communicating through subtle hand gestures as they advanced toward the main farm buildings visible in the distance. Behind them, the remaining bikers formed a loose tactical formation that reflected their military backgrounds and years of operating as a cohesive unit. What they couldn't see was Hank, positioned 400 yards away in a camouflaged hunting blind that overlooked the entire approach to his property. Through his scope, he methodically tracked their movements, noting their numbers, weapons, and the disciplined way they advanced. These weren't ordinary troublemakers. Their formation and communication patterns revealed training and experience that elevated the threat significantly. The first phase of Hank's defensive strategy involved allowing the intruders to commit fully to their trespass. By permitting them to advance deep into his property without resistance, he established clear intent that would later prove crucial if legal questions arose about his actions. More importantly, it drew them into terrain that he had spent years subtly modifying to serve his defensive purposes. The logging road the Razorbacks followed appeared to provide direct access to the main farm buildings, but a quarter-mile from the house, it crossed a wooden bridge spanning a wide drainage ditch. This bridge, though appearing sturdy and unremarkable, had been constructed with a concealed structural weakness that could be activated remotely. As the first pickup truck carrying Viper and 4 other senior members reached the midpoint of the bridge, Hank pressed a button on a remote detonator. The resulting explosion wasn't designed to injure, just to disable the bridge with minimal force. Strategic support beams separated cleanly as small charges detonated, causing the entire structure to sag dramatically, its middle section dropping into the ditch below. The truck's front wheels broke through the collapsing planks, sending the vehicle pitching forward at a steep angle that deployed its airbags and left it immobilized with its rear wheels spinning uselessly in the air. Behind it, motorcycles skidded to avoid the sudden obstacle, several riders losing control on the gravel surface. In the momentary chaos that followed, Hank activated the second phase of his defense: hidden sprinkler systems designed for irrigation. During drought conditions suddenly engaged, but instead of water, they sprayed a mixture of oil and farm chemicals across the road surface on both sides of the collapsed bridge. Motorcycles that had managed to remain upright now found themselves on a surface as slippery as ice, their riders fighting for control and largely failing. Through his communication system, Hank's calm voice suddenly filled the air from speakers concealed throughout the property. "This is your final warning. You are trespassing on private property with clear intent to cause harm. I have contacted law enforcement, and they are en route. Leave now by the eastern fence line, which I have left open, and this ends here." The eastern escape route was real. Hank had indeed left a gate open that would allow the intruders to depart. What he didn't mention was that this path would take them directly past 3 different game cameras that would capture clear images of every face and vehicle identification number. Viper Kazarian, extracting himself from the disabled truck with a bleeding gash across his forehead where he'd struck the windshield, was beyond reasoning. The public humiliation of their thwarted approach had transformed his calculated vengeance into blind rage. "Find him!" he screamed, drawing his pistol. "Burn everything to the ground." The Razorbacks abandoned their vehicles and began advancing on foot, spreading out to present less concentrated targets. Their weapons were now openly displayed: handguns, shotguns, and the heavy chains and bats that were their preferred tools for enforcement actions. Hank observed this escalation with the detached assessment of a combat veteran. They had crossed the final threshold by drawing firearms with clear intent to use them. The rules of engagement had shifted accordingly, and his response would now be proportional to the deadly threat they presented. The farm's outbuildings appeared ordinary to casual observation: weathered wooden structures that housed equipment, supplies, and the various necessities of agricultural life. What remained invisible were the defensive features Hank had incorporated: during their construction or subsequent modification. As the Razorbacks approached the nearest barn, motion sensors activated a recorded sound of movement inside equipment being shifted, the nervous stamping of livestock. 5 of the bikers, led by Demolition Walsh, moved to surround the structure while 2 others covered the main doors. When they breached the entrance, they found the interior empty of human presence, but filled with farm equipment, positioned to create a maze-like configuration that forced them to separate as they searched. Hidden speakers continued to project sounds that suggested movement just beyond their visual range, drawing them deeper into the strategic labyrinth. Hank, having relocated to a new position, activated the barn's secondary defense system. Doors suddenly slammed shut and locked automatically, while overhead sprinklers released a mixture that included livestock, sedative typically used when transporting anxious animals. The aerosolized compound wasn't lethal but would cause disorientation and drowsiness within minutes of exposure. From their perspective, the trapped Razorbacks experienced a nightmare scenario locked in an unfamiliar environment, filled with obstacles that prevented clear lines of sight, breathing air that made thinking increasingly difficult as their coordination deteriorated. Their training and experience counted for little against an enemy who had prepared the battlefield so thoroughly and remained frustratingly invisible. Outside, the remaining bikers were encountering similar difficulties. The Terror Twins had approached the farmhouse directly, assuming they would find Hank inside. The front door was unlocked, an invitation that triggered their suspicion, but not sufficiently to prevent them from entering. The interior appeared normal, though surprisingly sparse, with minimal furniture and few personal possessions visible. As they moved through the kitchen toward the rear of the house, pressure plates concealed beneath the floorboards activated another defense. Metal shutters slammed down over windows and doors, while emergency lighting bathed the interior in a fine coal. Shutters slammed down over windows and doors. Disorienting strobing effect, timed specifically to trigger sensory confusion. In the ensuing disorientation, neither twin noticed the fine mist being released from air vents, a pepper spray derivative, diluted to non-damaging levels but sufficiently potent to make breathing uncomfortable and vision difficult. By the time they realized the nature of the trap, both were coughing uncontrollably, eyes streaming as they blindly sought escape from a house that had transformed into a sophisticated containment system. Viper and his 3 remaining lieutenants found themselves isolated in the center of the property, their force effectively divided and neutralized without a single direct confrontation. It was at this moment that Hank finally revealed himself, stepping from the tree line wearing full tactical gear, including body armor and a combat helmet with visor that concealed his features. "Your people are contained, not harmed," his voice carried across the distance between them, amplified by his helmet's external speaker system. "They'll remain that way until law enforcement arrives unless you force a different outcome." Viper's response was predictable. He raised his pistol and fired 3 rapid shots. The distance and his compromised aim from the earlier injury caused all 3 rounds to miss their target. Before he could adjust, Hank had already moved, using the terrain features he knew intimately to disappear from view. The 4 remaining Razorbacks found themselves in an impossible tactical situation, exposed in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. When Ghost Wilson attempted to flank the position where Hank had been spotted, he triggered a snare trap that left him suspended upside down from a tree branch, his weapon fallen beyond reach. "I spent 22 years in places where people like you were considered amateurs," Hank's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the sound system making localization impossible. "I'm giving you an opportunity most of my previous opponents never received, a chance to walk away." Butcher Reeves, still nursing injuries from their previous encounter, had finally reached his breaking point. "This is insane, Viper. The old man's playing with us. We need to regroup." But Viper Kazarian had built his reputation and leadership on never retreating, never showing weakness. We find him, we end him, or none of us will be able to show our faces in any club again. The 3 remaining bikers began a systematic search pattern, moving toward the workshop building that represented the last major structure they hadn't explored. As they approached, Hank observed from his new position near the property's water tower. He had hoped to contain the situation without direct confrontation, but their persistence had eliminated that option. The workshop, unlike the other buildings, contained legitimate hazards, acetylene tanks for welding, pressurized hydraulic systems, chemicals used in equipment maintenance. A firefight in such an environment could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. Hank couldn't allow the confrontation to reach that space. Moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him legendary among special operations communities, Hank circled behind the approaching bikers. The first indication Butcher Reeves had of his presence was the cold pressure of a rifle muzzle against the base of his skull. "Drop it," Hank ordered, his voice now devoid of any emotion. "Or I guarantee you won't leave this farm except in a body bag." Butcher froze, then slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. Behind him, Viper and Demolition Walsh turned to find themselves covered by a man whose stance and weapon handling told them everything they needed to know about his capabilities. "You've made a fatal mistake," Viper said, his voice struggling to maintain its customary control. "Even if you take us down, the club has chapters in 5 states. There's nowhere you can hide." "I'm not hiding," Hank replied simply. "I haven't moved from this property in 7 years, and I don't intend to start now. What you should be asking yourself is whether you want to die today for a shortcut that would have saved you 15 minutes of travel time." The standoff might have concluded there, if not for the unexpected arrival of 3 additional motorcycles carrying Razorbacks who had been delayed and missed the initial confrontation. Seeing their president held at gunpoint, they immediately opened fire without assessing the full tactical situation. Hank reacted with the instinctive speed of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. He dropped to a prone position, returning targeted fire that wounded but didn't kill 2 of the new arrivals. In the chaos, Viper seized the opportunity to retrieve his fallen weapon, swinging it toward Hank with murderous intent. The shot that prevented Viper from firing didn't come from Hank's weapon. It originated from the tree line to the east where a man in civilian clothing, but with an unmistakably military bearing, had appeared holding a scoped rifle. The round struck Viper's hand, shattering bone and sending his pistol spinning away. "Target neutralized," the newcomer's voice carried across the suddenly silent farmyard. "Area secure." 2 more figures emerged from different positions around the perimeter, similarly armed and moving with the coordinated precision of professional operators. The Razorbacks found themselves surrounded by a force they hadn't known existed. "Meet some old colleagues," Hank said, rising to his feet with weapons still trained on the remaining threats. They happened to be in the area for a training exercise. Fortunate timing. The man who had fired the disabling shot approached, his expression revealing nothing as he surveyed the scene. "Sergeant Major Thornfield," he acknowledged Hank with a respectful nod. "Looks like retirement isn't agreeing with you." "Colonel Blackburn," Hank returned the greeting. "Your timing remains impeccable." The revelation of Hank's former rank registered on the faces of the conscious Razorbacks. The implications were transformative. They hadn't been outmaneuvered by a simple farmer, but by a decorated special operations veteran with decades of combat experience. Over the next hour, the situation resolved with methodical efficiency. The Razorbacks who had been contained in the barn were emerging from their sedative-induced confusion, while the Terror Twins had finally located an emergency release for the farmhouse security shutters and stumbled out, still coughing and disoriented. Colonel Blackburn's team 3 men, who never provided names or explained their official capacity, secured the trespassers with professional detachment. When county sheriff's deputies finally arrived, They found 27 Razorbacks sitting in orderly rows under guard, their weapons neatly stacked and catalogued as evidence. Sheriff Daniel Hargrove surveyed the scene with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Hank," he said quietly after pulling the farmer aside, "this is beyond anything we've dealt with before. These men have connections, lawyers. This won't end with arrests." "It already has ended, Daniel," Hank replied with absolute certainty, "because every one of them now understands exactly what's waiting for them if they ever return to this property." He handed the sheriff a data drive. "This contains video documentation of everything that occurred today, from their arrival with clear intent to commit violence through every action they took. Their weapons are there, with fingerprints intact. There are multiple witnesses with impeccable credentials who can testify to their attempted murder of a landowner defending his property." Sheriff Hargrove recognized the checkmate position when he saw it. With documented evidence of armed trespassing, attempted arson, and deadly assault, even the most connected motorcycle club would struggle to mount an effective legal defense. The potential prison sentences would run into decades. As the Razorbacks were loaded into transport vehicles, Viper Kazarian, his hand bandaged and his pride destroyed, locked eyes with Hank. "This doesn't change anything," he started to say. But Hank interrupted him with a statement delivered in the calm, measured tone that had characterized his actions throughout the confrontation. "It changes everything," Hank said. "Because now, you have a choice between accepting that you made a devastating mistake or spending the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. The documentation my colleagues have compiled includes enough evidence to classify your club as a criminal organization under RICO statutes. Every chapter, every member becomes vulnerable. Your entire structure collapses." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so that only Viper could hear the next words. "Or you can consider this a lesson in choosing your battles more carefully. Your people walk away with relatively minor charges that your lawyers can probably plead down to misdemeanors. Your club continues operating, and you never come within 50 miles of my property again." The calculation was visible in Viper's eyes, the weighing of pride against pragmatic survival. Finally, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "We're done here," he said. "But don't think this makes you untouchable, old man. The world's changing. People like you are dinosaurs." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.